This week we're going to talk in Chapter 13 about vulnerability assessment and data security. The objectives of this chapter are to look at the security posture of an enterprise, how a vulnerability assessment is conducted, and why it's important, the difference between vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, and the different techniques that we can use to practice data privacy and security. Because when we're talking about security posture, first step in any security plan, it begins with the assessment of the security posture of the enterprise. So what this does, it looks at and sees what existing vulnerabilities that exist that has to be addressed. And there's a variety of techniques and tools that we can use for this. So we can define a vulnerability assessment as a systematic and methodical evaluation of the security posture of the enterprise. So what it does, it looks and says, this is how we are exposed to attackers, whether the forces of nature or whatever potentially harmful entities are there. We do have some aspects of vulnerability assessment we'll go over. We'll do asset identification, threat evaluation, vulnerability appraisal, risk assessment, and then risk mitigation. Asset identification is inventorying items with economic value. Now, the common assets can be people, physical assets, hardware, data, software. We take an inventory of those, and after we do that, we look and we put a value to determine the relative value of that asset to the organization. Some factors we need to consider when we're determining the value is how critical the asset is to the goals of the operation, how much revenue the asset generates, how difficult it will be to replace the asset, and then the impact of the asset's unavailability to this organization. Now, once they do that, some organizations will assign a numeric value to the assets, with 5 being extremely valuable, 1 being least valuable, to determine the value of that asset. All right, the threat evaluations. This is where we're looking at a potential threat that comes from a threat agent, from an attacker. A threat agent is any person or thing with power to carry out a threat against an asset. All right, so when we look at this, we go in, do the threat modeling, which the goal of this is to understand attackers and their methods. This can be done by creating and constructing threat scenarios. Now, one of the ways we can do this is do an attack tree, which is going to provide a visual representation of potential attacks. And this will be drawn as an inverted tree structure. We can also categorize the threats. For example, we see that natural disasters, example is a fire, flood, earthquake that would destroy the data. How do we mitigate that? How do we, when we look at the threat evaluations, we look at how can we minimize that later on in this. So we look at here, we can see that we have human error. So example is this: the employee drops the laptop computer in a parking lot. Okay, it's going to break the laptop. It's not going to be accessible. We can also look at threat evaluations through the attack tree. So in this threat evaluation here, we look and say, okay, the threat is that someone steals the car stereo. Okay, then we can break it down as the break glass, steal key, carjack. Those are 3 different ways that someone could gain access to steal the car stereo. Well, then we look and say, well, how could they steal the key? Well, they could grab a purse, or they could make a copy of it. And we can further break this down here to where they get access to the key to make the copy by threatening the attendant, blackmail attendant, or bribe attendant. And this can go for each one of these. We can have different trees for each category here. So we see an example here of how this would apply to digital. In this case, logging into a restricted account. So that is the threat. Threat is how they log into a restricted account. A couple ways they could get in there is steal the password digest file. They can learn the password, or they could guess the password. Following down the learn password, we can see that they can find a written password, or they can get the password from the user. A couple ways they can get the password from the user is to install a keylogger or shoulder surf, and view the password being typed in. So we complete our threat evaluation, then we go to our vulnerability appraisal. With this, it determines the current weaknesses. We also take a snapshot of the current organization security, and we're going to look at each asset in view of each threat. And then we're going to catalog each vulnerability. We then go to risk assessment. So we look to determine how damage that would result from an attack, and also how likelihood the vulnerability is a risk to an organization. So we look here, we say the impact is no attack. So this vulnerability will not affect the organization. The example they give here is the theft of a mouse attached to a desktop computer will not affect the operations of the organization. Okay, in that case, you would just replace the mouse. We go all the way through small impact, significant, major, and then catastrophic. So the vulnerabilities for that, catastrophic description, vulnerabilities that are ranked as catastrophic are events that would cause the organization to cease functionality or to be seriously crippled in its capacity to perform. So as an example, here's a tornado that destroys an office building, and all the company's data could be a catastrophic vulnerability. Risk mitigation is where we determine what to do about risk and how much risk can be tolerated. So we look at our vulnerability assessment steps here. We got our asset identification. So we inventory assets, determine the asset's value. Threat identification, where we classify the threats by category and then design our attack trees. The vulnerability appraisal is determine the current weakness in protecting the assets. The risk assessment will estimate the impact of the vulnerability on an organization, and also will calculate the risk of the likelihood and the impact of the risk. And finally, the risk mitigation will determine what to do about the risk. Now, there is a lot of vulnerability assessment tools. We see on the screen a few here: port scanners, protocol analyzers, vulnerability scanners, honeypots and honeynets, banner grabbing tools, crackers, command line tools, and then there are a lot of other tools as well. Support scanners use TCP IP communications. Okay, so that's where the information exchange between one system's program and another system's program. It's going to use a numeric value as an identifier to the applications and the services of these systems, the port number. Port number is a unique identifier for application services, and it's 16 bits in length. So we look at the port scanners. The ports are going to be divided into three categories. You got well-known ports, which are going to be reserved for most universal applications. Registered port numbers. These are applications that are not widely used. And you also have dynamic and private port numbers. Now, knowledge of what port is being used, that's something that can be used by the attacker to target a specific service. Okay, so if they know a well-known port is used, they can plan their attack to attack that service. They can also use port scanner software, which is going to search the system for port vulnerabilities. This is something that the attackers and the organization can use to find out their ports. And it's used to determine the port state, whether the port is open, closed, or blocked. It's a good practice that if you're not using a port, to have it closed or blocked. You don't want to leave a port open. Okay, so we see an example here of an advanced port scanner where it's scanned the group of IP ranges. And in here they have found 5 open ports. And then the protocols that are associated with those open ports. Granted, we can only see 3. Protocol analyzers, it's hardware or software that captures packets to decode and analyze the contents. These are also going to be known as sniffers. They're used by network administrators for troubleshooting, security analysis. They can also characterize the network traffic, and they can be used to manage the bandwidth and fine-tune the network. We see here that one of these is the Wireshark software, one of the protocol analyzers. And in this here, for example, you can see that, for example, the protocol on this is the HTTP. Okay, you can filter these to search for different protocols, IP addresses, and so forth. Vulnerability scanners are a generic term for a range of products that look for vulnerabilities in networks and systems. Now, what these are intended for are to identify vulnerabilities and alert network administrators. We've got two types of vulnerability scanners. We have active scanners and passive scanners. Active scanners are going to send probes to network devices, and it's going to examine the response back to evaluate whether a specific device needs attention. Passive scanners, they can identify current software operating systems and applications being used on the network and indicate which devices might have a vulnerability. Now, these cannot take action to resolve security problems. These are used to alert about problems. And a couple things they can do is they alert when new systems are added to the network, detect when an application is compromised or when an internal system begins to port scan other systems. They also detect which ports are served and which ports are browsed for each individual system. They identify which applications and server hosts or transmit sensitive data. Maintain a log of all interactive network sessions. Track client and server application vulnerabilities. And they also track which systems communicate with other internal systems. So we see here some types of vulnerability scanners. You have a network mapping scanner. And they can be used to create visual maps of the network. It also identifies vulnerabilities that need correction. So a wireless scanner detects security weaknesses inside the local wireless network. And you have a configuration compliance scanner. That's used to evaluate and report any compliance issues related to a specific industry guidelines. Here's an example of a configuration compliance scanner. Now, honeypots are computers protected with minimal security. They're intentionally going to be configured this way so we can draw the attacker's attention to the honeypot. Okay, and it may have bogus data files set up. It's got files there that's going to try to draw their attention. And the goal of this is to trick the attacker into revealing their techniques. Okay, so then we can look at their techniques being used to attack. We'll determine if actual production systems could stop that attack. You can also set up a honey net. That's a network that's only set up with one or more honeypots. And it's going to be set up with intentional vulnerabilities. Okay, so the whole goal of this is that we're going to draw the attacker's attention away from our network, from our real productive network. We're going to set up this network or this honeypot computer with minimal security and vulnerabilities. We're going to look and see what type of attacks are coming in. We see a honeypot dashboard here. We see that we've got the target port or IP that we can analyze here. All right, banners are message or servers that transmit when another program connects to it. All right, so this is normally something that will show the type of server software, version number, when it was last modified, and other information such as that. Banner grabbing is when a program is used to intentionally gather this information. Now, what this could be is it's an assessment tool to perform an inventory on the services and systems operating on a server. And so something that if the information is grabbed, it can be used to gain information about the type of server, type of software being used. Crackers are intended to break or crack the security of a system. You can use a cracker in a vulnerability assessment to determine how secure your system is. They also have wireless crackers that are designed to test the security of wireless LAN systems. Just trying to break the protections in the Wi-Fi protected access or the WPA2. The password cracker, that's intended to break the digest of the passwords to determine its strength. You also have a lot of different command line tools. Located here, the ping tool will test the connection between two network devices. The ART will view and modify the address resolution protocol cache. ipconfig will display all the current TCP IP network configurations. And a lot of these other ones here. The trace route, for example, will show the path that a packet takes. So those are third-party tools. can be used for vulnerability scanning, or there are third-party tools that can be used for vulnerability scanning, such as Nmap, which is a network mapper. It's a security vulnerability scanner that can determine which devices are connected to the network. And Netcat is a command line alternative to Nmap. We have other tools here as well. The exploitation framework, it's used to replicate attacks during the vulnerability assessment. Provides a structure of exploits and monitoring tools. Steganography is where that's a technique of hiding existing data, hiding information inside of video files, images, data files. Okay, so you can also use the tools here to determine if that data is hidden well enough. Vulnerability scan is automated software that searches through a system for known security weaknesses. After it does this, it will create a report of potential exposures, and it should be compared against the baseline scans, and any changes can be investigated. Okay, so when we set up our computers, or set up our organization, we've got a baseline. This is how they should perform. And if they're not performing along that baseline, we can look at the vulnerability scan and see what is going on. Scan can identify vulnerabilities and security weaknesses found in the system, identify lack of security controls, and also looks for types of common misconfigurations. You've got two methods for performing a vulnerability scan. You have intrusive and non-intrusive. Intrusive attempts to actually penetrate the system to perform a simulated attack, while non-intrusive is only uses available information to hypothesize the status of the vulnerability. Credential vulnerability scan. That's where you provide the credentials such as username and password to the scanner. So it tests for additional internal vulnerabilities. Non-credential scans do not use credentials. Penetration testing are designed to exploit the system weakness. All right, the success of this is going to rely on the tester's skill, knowledge, and cunning. And this is something that's usually conducted by an independent contractor and are usually going to be conducted outside the security perimeter. And as a result, you'll have a penetration test result. Got three different techniques can be used. You have a black box test where the tester has no prior knowledge of network infrastructure. And this is going to be the one that's going to more closely resemble a real attack. White box testing, they have in-depth knowledge of the network systems being tested. And gray box is where they have some limited information that's been provided to the tester. Two methods which this information is gathered will be active reconnaissance and passive reconnaissance. Okay, active involves actively probing the system to find the information. Reconnaissance is just using the tools that do not raise any alarms. So once they've done the test, they've gathered their information. Next step is to perform an initial exploitation. So we've used that information to determine if it provides entry into a secure network. Once inside the network, they're going to try to move around. The goal in this is to get the privilege escalation or exploit a vulnerability to access higher level resources in the organization. Enterprise data theft. This may involve stealing proprietary business information, such as the research for a new product or a secret formula. Personal data is going to involve the theft of personal data, such as credit card numbers, identity theft. So you want to make sure that you practice data privacy and security. Do that, you need to understand what privacy is and what steps are needed to keep data safe. All right, privacy, that's a state or condition of being free from public attention to the degree that you determine. Basically, it's the right to be left alone to the level that you have chosen. In today's world, data is going to be collected in almost all the actions you do today. Whether it's surfing the web, purchases you've made, surveys, questionnaires. Data is then going to be sold by data brokers. All right, so they're going to take that data and they're going to sell it to interested third parties. Now, with the private data, you do have risks, and it's going to fall into three categories: individual inconveniences and identity theft, association with groups, or statistical uh, information. Now, this has brought concerns by individuals regarding how their private data is being used. And it's developed into some laws, such as the HIPAA law, which is the privacy for your medical records. So there's the need to keep data private and secure, has made laws or led to laws, legislation that's set up the rules, regulations. Things you can do to keep your data secure is create and follow an overall security methodology. Organizations can set up proper labeling and handling of sensitive data, and also make sure that data is destroyed when it's no longer needed. All right, secure methodologies, the standard techniques for mitigating and deterring attacks, creating a security posture, selecting and configuring controls, hardening and reporting are some of the steps you can do with this. So when you look at creating a security posture, that's the approach strategy regarding security. So in this, you create an initial baseline configuration. You want your computer to do, your organization's security set up as. That's your standard security checklist. Your systems are going to be evaluated against that baseline. You want to make sure that you continue to monitor this. Regularly observe your systems and networks. Make sure that they're staying on that baseline. If not, if you have vulnerabilities that are exposed, you want to put a plan in to address them. So we see our security goals of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and safety. Common controls for this, for example, confidentialities include encryption or access controls, going with the principle of least privilege. Integrity, make sure the data has not been changed, includes hashing digital signatures. Availability, redundancy, where you want the information available when you need it in a timely manner. Safety may include fencing and lighting, escape plans, routes, safety drills, those type of things. All right, the key to mitigating and deterring attacks is have properly configured controls. Some of these controls are used for detection, such as security cameras. Some controls are for prevention, having a properly placed security guard. You can also have information security controls, which should be something that can detect attacks and sound alarms or even prevent the attacks. So when you're configuring your controls, some additional considerations to take in is when a normal function is interrupted by a failure, what is the higher priority, safety or security? Maybe fail open locks that unlocks the doors automatically upon failure, or it may be one that has a fail safe lock that automatically locks. And firewalls can also be configured in fail safe or fail open state as well. All right, the purpose of hardening is to eliminate as many security risks as possible. Some types of hardening techniques include protecting accounts with passwords, disabling unnecessary accounts or unnecessary services, and protecting management interfaces and applications. Okay, so basically what you're doing is you're just taking your security vulnerabilities and you're hardening them. You're trying to eliminate them. For example, disabling unnecessary accounts. If you have an account that's not being used and it's still active, that is a security risk. So by disabling it, you are hardening your system. Reporting, this is where you give information regarding events that occur This is something that leads up to where action can be taken. Now, reporting may be alarms or alerts that sound a warning if a specific situation is occurring. The example they give is an alert is too many failed password attempts. Reporting can also provide information on trends, so it can indicate a serious impending situation. The example, the multiple user accounts experiencing multiple password attempts. That could give you an idea that you're under attack. Data labeling and handling. Okay, for data sensitive data must be labeled properly. If it is not labeled properly, if it is mislabeled, it could accidentally be published or distributed to the public. So we see some examples here of data labels: confidential, private, proprietary, public, personal, identifiable information, or public health information. So we see that confidential, highest level of security, should only be made available to the users with the highest level of pre-approved authentication. Private is restricted data with medium level, and that's for users who need a know basis of the contents. Proprietary belongs to the enterprise or the organization, and this can be available to any current employees or contractors. May not necessarily be. Public, you have no risk of release because it is for the public. The data is labeled, it's assumed to be public information. The personally identifiable information is data that potentially identify a specific individual. That should be kept secure so the individual cannot be singled out for identification. The protected health information, that's data about a person's health status, payment for health care, provisions of health care, and that is mandated by HIPAA laws to be kept secure. So it's important that you destroy data in a proper manner. Paper media can be destroyed by burning, shredding, pulping, or pulverizing. I recommend that you use a cross shredder or burn the paper. Electronic media, okay, just because you delete it using your operating system, your data, you should never think that it's gone. Okay, that data can still be retrieved by using third-party tools. Wiping the data, that's overriding the disk space with zeros or random data. Or you can also use a magnetic field, permanently destroy the entire magnetic device, magnetic-based drive, by reducing or eliminating the magnetic field. So chapter 13, we looked at vulnerability assessments, the different types of tools available. We looked at vulnerability scans, penetration testing, privacy, data destruction, and data labeling.